Welcome to Fireside Chat with Beth and Matt, where we break down the latest in radiology and AI.
That's right.
Sit back, relax, and let's explore how large language models are reshaping the field of medical imaging.
Yeah. It's really amazing to see how quickly this field is advancing.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It seems like every week there's a new breakthrough or some crazy application that we're trying to wrap our heads around.
It really does feel that way.
But you know what? For all of you listening out there, I totally get it. It's a lot to keep up with.
Absolutely.
And that's actually what we're going to try to do in this deep dive today.
Yep.
We're going to focus on giving you a solid understanding of LLMs, what they are, how they work, and what their potential impact could be in radiology.
Yeah, so we came across this really insightful article recently that kind of serves as a practical primer on LLMs in radiology.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
It covers the basics, the limitations, the promising applications, really gives you a comprehensive overview without getting bogged down in too much technical jargon.
Yeah, because that can be a bit much sometimes. Yeah.
We want to make sure you walk away from this feeling like you've got a good grasp on these LLMs.
Exactly.
So you can make informed decisions about how to potentially integrate them into your practice or research.
And feel confident in understanding the implications.
Absolutely.
For your work.
Okay, so the article kicks things off with a little history lesson.
It does.
Takes us all the way back to 1966 with the ELIZA program, which, if you don't know, was like one of the very first chatbots.
Right, kind of a pioneer in its own way.
It's pretty wild to think about how far we've come since those early days.
Yeah, it really is.
So I'm curious, what would you say was the pivotal turning point that really propelled us from those like basic programs to the sophisticated AI chatbots we're seeing today?
Well, the article highlights the advancements in something called natural language processing, or NLP.
NLP.
Yeah, NLP for short.
Okay.
And, in the early 2010s, we started seeing virtual assistants like Siri and Google Assistant, which were definitely a step up from Eliza.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But they still had limitations in their ability to really understand and generate natural-sounding human language.
Yeah, they weren't quite there yet.
Right.
You'd ask them a question and sometimes they'd give you something totally out of left field.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it felt like you were talking to a wall.
Totally.
But then late 2022 comes along.
Yes.
And OpenAI drops this bombshell called ChatGPT.
Game changer.
Yeah, it was a game changer.
It just blew everyone away with its ability to perform across a wide range of language-based tasks.
Yeah, and not just perform them, but actually achieve, like, human-level performance on some professional benchmark.
I know, it was incredible.
Yeah.
So that's really when things started to shift and people began realizing the true power of these large language models.
Absolutely. That was a defining moment for sure.
Okay, so we've been talking about these LLMs, large language models.
Yeah.
Can you break it down for us? What are they exactly?
So at their core, LLMs are language models
Right.
trained on massive amounts of text data. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about huge data sets, primarily from the internet.
Wow.
And what they do is they learn by processing all this text, identifying statistical patterns and relationships between words.
So they're not programmed with specific rules or anything like that?
No, not in the traditional sense. They're
Right.
more like learning by example, by observing how language is used in the real world.
Interesting.
So they essentially learn the probabilities of words appearing together in different contexts.
So given a certain prompt or a starting phrase, they can predict what the next word or the next sentence should be.
Right, and they do this with remarkable accuracy.
That's pretty impressive.
It is, yeah.
But the article mentions something called the transformer model.
Right.
It was introduced in 2017.
Yeah.
And it says that was a key breakthrough for LLMs.
Yeah, that's really what enabled LLMs to reach this level of sophistication.
Okay, so can you explain what the transformer model is and why it was such a big deal?
Sure. So before transformers, older models used what were called recurrent neural networks, or RNNs.
RNNs?
Okay. And these RNNs, they had to process words one after another sequentially,
Yeah.
which made it really difficult for them to grasp relationships between words that were far apart in a sentence or in longer pieces of text.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the transformer architecture came along, and it did something fundamentally different.
Okay.
It processes all the words in a sequence simultaneously in parallel.
All at once.
All at once, yeah. And you might think, well, if it's processing everything in parallel, doesn't it lose track of the order of the words?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because the order is really important for understanding the meaning.
Absolutely. And that's where the brilliance of the transformer lies.
Okay.
It uses something called positional encoding.
Positional encoding.
Yeah, which essentially gives each word a unique marker based on its position in the sentence.
So it knows where each word falls in the sequence, even though it's processing them all at the same time.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
And even more importantly, it uses these self-attention mechanisms.
Self-attention.
Yep.
Okay, this is getting a little technical,
It is, yeah.
but I think it's important.
It is, because this is really the heart of how transformers work.
Okay.
So imagine you have a sentence like this. The radiologist saw a mass with spiculated margins.
Okay.
It measures 4 centimeters.
Right. Classic radiology report.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, what a transformer can do is simultaneously assess the importance of every other word in that sentence when it's trying to understand any single word.
So it's like it's looking at all the words in context at the same time?
Right, precisely.
Oh, okay.
So it recognizes that the phrase with spiculated margins is providing key information about the mass.
Yep.
It understands that the word it refers back to the mass.
Uh-huh.
And it knows that the 4 centimeter measurement is also describing the mass.
Wow.
So this parallel processing combined with self-attention allows transformers to capture these complex relationships within language much more effectively than those older sequential models.
Okay, that makes sense.
And on top of that, it allows them to be trained much more efficiently on these massive data sets because they can leverage the parallel processing capabilities of modern hardware.
So it's a win-win situation.
Exactly.
You get better understanding of language and faster training time.
Exactly.
Awesome.
So that's why transformers were such a game changer for natural language processing.
I see.
And they're the foundation of these powerful LLMs that we're talking about today.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now.
That's it.
Now, the article also mentions that when it comes to LLMs, bigger is usually better,
Yeah.
meaning the number of parameters.
Right.
But it also emphasizes that it's not the only factor to consider.
Absolutely.
So can you unpack that for us?
Sure. So the size of an LLM is basically indicated by the number of parameters it has.
Parameters.
Yeah. Think of parameters as the connections between the artificial neurons in the model.
Okay, so more parameters, more connections,
Exactly.
more complexity.
Right.
Got it.
So generally speaking, more parameters allow the model to learn and represent more complex patterns from the data.
Okay.
So it can capture more nuances in language and handle new types of input more effectively.
That makes sense.
However, size isn't everything.
Right.
The quality and the volume of the training data are equally critical.
So it's not just about having a huge model, it's also about feeding it the right kind of data.
Exactly. You need both.
Okay.
And you need to find the right balance between the model's capacity, which is its size, and the amount of training data you give it.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
It is, yeah.
I understand.
Figure 1 in the article actually shows a really cool visual representation of the scale of different LLMs and the data sets that they've been trained on.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of just how massive some of these models and data sets are.
Okay, so as these models get larger and they're trained on more data,
Yeah,
they start to exhibit these emergent abilities,
right.
which the article describes as capabilities that they weren't specifically programmed for.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, actually.
It is.
Like, they develop these skills that weren't explicitly designed or fine-tuned into them.
So how does that work?
It's still an active area of research, but it seems like these emergent abilities arise as a result of the model's sheer scale and the vast amount of data they're exposed to.
So they're kind of learning on their own in a way.
In a way, yeah. It's like they're picking up on these patterns and relationships in the data that even the developers didn't anticipate.
Wow.
And this has led to some really significant shifts in the field of natural language processing.
Like what?
Well, the article talks about the rise of few-shot, single-shot, and even zero-shot learning.
Okay, what do those terms mean?
So few-shot learning means that an LLM can adapt to a new task with just a few examples.
Okay.
Single-shot learning means it can learn from just one example.
Wow.
And zero-shot learning means it can sometimes perform tasks without any specific examples at all.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is.
So for someone like you in radiology,
Hmm.
what are the implications of this?
Well, traditionally, if you wanted to train an AI model for a specific task in radiology, you would need thousands of labeled examples.
Right, like radiology reports or images,
Exactly.
specific findings annotated and all that.
Yeah, it was a very time-consuming and resource-intensive process.
Okay.
But now, with these larger LLMs and these emergent abilities, you might be able to achieve decent performance with far fewer examples.
So it could potentially save a lot of time and effort.
Absolutely.
That's pretty exciting.
It is.
The article gives some pretty compelling examples of how these LLMs are performing on some really challenging benchmarks,
It does.
like the Uniform Bar Exam and the LSAM.
Yeah, GPT-4 achieved really impressive scores on those exams.
And even more relevant to our audience, it mentions GPT-4 and Google's MedPal M2, both scoring really highly on the USMLE.
Yeah, the United States Medical Licensing Examination,
Right.
which is a standardized exam for medical students and physicians.
So these LLMs are demonstrating a pretty sophisticated understanding of medical knowledge. And it also specifically mentions GPT-4 passing a radiology board-style exam
It does.
and showing significantly improved reasoning abilities compared to its earlier version, GPT 3.5.
Right.
So it seems like these models are really starting to grasp the complexities of radiology.
They are making significant progress in that area.
But the article also includes a really important note of caution,
It does.
which I think is worth emphasizing.
Absolutely.
So what is it that people need to be aware of when they're considering applying these LLMs to their clinical practice?
Well, the article is very clear that while these exam results are really impressive and they highlight the rapid progress of LLMs in understanding and processing medical knowledge,
Yeah.
they should not be interpreted as a direct indication that these models are ready for unsupervised use in clinical settings.
Okay, so it's not a green light to just let these models run wild in the hospital.
Exactly.
Got it.
Passing a standardized exam is not the same as possessing the nuanced clinical judgment that's required for safe and effective patient care.
Right. There are still so many factors that go into making a diagnosis and treating a patient that these models might not fully grasp.
Absolutely.
Like the patient's individual circumstances, their medical history, their preferences, all those things.
Right, and the potential for unexpected complications or variations in how diseases present themselves.
Exactly.
So it's crucial to remember that these models are still tools.
Tool,
Yes, tools that can augment our abilities.
but not replace them entirely.
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's switch gears a bit and talk about multimodal LLMs,
Okay.
which the article introduces as LLMs that can process multiple types of data simultaneously, like
Oh,
text
yeah.
and images.
Yeah.
For our audience in radiology, this seems particularly relevant
Oh, absolutely.
because you're dealing with images and text all the time.
All the time.
So can you explain why multimodal LLMs are so potentially transformative for radiology?
Well, what makes them so powerful is this ability to process different types of data at the same time. So, for example, they can look at an image and read a text description and integrate that information together,
Okay.
which is much closer to how we as humans understand the world.
Right. We don't just look at things in isolation.
Exactly.
We consider all the information we have available.
Right.
And in radiology, that's especially important.
It is.
When you're making a diagnosis, you're not just looking at the images.
No.
You're also considering the patient's history, their symptoms, the results of other tests,
All of that.
and you're integrating all that information together to form a conclusion.
Precisely.
So a model that can do the same thing could be incredibly valuable.
It could.
The article mentions vision language models as a key example of multimodal LLMs.
It does.
And it explains how the transformer architecture that we talked about earlier is being adapted to handle these different types of information within a single model.
Right.
So we're seeing these medicine-specific multimodal LLMs emerging, like MedPal M and Alave Med.
Yeah, and they're already showing really promising results in early studies.
That's exciting.
It is.
But it's important to note that general-purpose multimodal models like GPT-4 with Vision and Google's Gemini,
Yeah.
they're not specifically trained on extensive medical data sets.
Right. So their performance on radiology-specific tasks might not be as good.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So maybe in the future, we could have a model that can look at a medical image,
Right.
understand the patient's medical history from text,
Yeah.
and then generate a comprehensive radiology report.
That's the vision.
That would be amazing.
It would.
And it sounds like we're already taking steps in that direction with these models that can perform image captioning.
Yeah, so they can generate some kind of text description based on what they see in the image.
Okay.
And the article even mentions studies where clinicians actually preferred the reports generated by certain multimodal LLMs for specific types of images, like chest x-rays.
Wow. So they were actually better than the human-generated reports in some cases.
Yeah, in some cases.
That's really impressive.
It is.
And Figure 4 in the article provides a simplified representation of this process.
Right. It gives you a visual idea of how it works.
So it seems like multimodal LLMs have the potential to significantly improve the efficiency and accuracy of radiology reporting
Absolutely.
and potentially even enhance the quality of patient care.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about the potential benefits of LLMs,
Yeah,
but it's also important to discuss the limitations.
that is.
And the article dedicates a good portion of that as well.
Yeah. There are definitely some challenges that we need to address.
Let's start with the issue of hallucinations,
Okay.
which the article describes as the generation of inaccurate or completely fabricated information by LLMs.
Yeah, that's a major concern, especially in a field like radiology where precision is paramount
Absolutely.
because these models learn from the data they're trained on,
Right.
and that data might contain errors or biases.
Yeah, or it might be incomplete,
Exactly.
and they don't have access to real-world knowledge or real-time information beyond their training cutoff. So they can sometimes produce outputs that are incorrect or just nonsensical, like making up facts or drawing conclusions that aren't supported by the evidence.
Exactly.
And in a medical setting, that's obviously a big problem.
It is a serious concern.
So what are some of the strategies that are being explored to try to mitigate these hallucinations?
Well, the article outlines several approaches.
Okay.
One is prompt engineering, which involves carefully designing the input you give to the model to provide clear instructions and relevant context.
So it's like giving the model very specific guidance on what you want it to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another promising technique is retrieval augmented generation, or RAG.
RAG.
Yeah, RAG for sure. And this involves connecting the LLM to external trusted sources of information.
Like what kind of sources?
Well, it could be things like PubMed, which is a massive database of medical literature,
Okay.
or it could be a hospital's internal guidelines or protocols.
So the model can essentially fact-check its responses against these trusted sources.
Right, exactly.
That's a good idea.
It is.
And then there's fine-tuning,
Right.
which involves further training the model on specific data sets.
Yeah. And this can include using human feedback to refine its behavior and prove its accuracy.
So it's like giving the model a little extra training to make sure it's performing well on the tasks we need it to perform.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the article also mentions domain-specific models like RadBERT and Radiology GPT.
Those are models that are specifically trained on radiology data.
Right. So they have a better understanding of the language and concepts used in radiology.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it also highlights successful applications of RAG using resources like the ACR appropriateness criteria.
Yeah, which are guidelines developed by the American College of Radiology to help physicians determine when imaging tests are appropriate.
So RAG can help ensure that the LLM's recommendations are consistent with those established guidelines.
Exactly.
That's really important.
It is.
Okay, so RAG seems like a really promising approach for radiology.
It does.
But what about other limitations? The article also talks about deficiencies in complex reasoning.
Yeah. So while the newer LLMs are showing improvements in their reasoning capabilities, complex multi-step reasoning is still a bit of a challenge.
Okay, and why is that a problem for radiology?
Well, radiology often requires this kind of nuanced thinking,
Yeah.
synthesizing information from different sources, considering various possibilities, arriving at a well-supported conclusion.
Right, it's not just a simple matter of looking at an image and saying, oh, that's a fracture.
No.
There's a lot more thought process involved.
Absolutely.
So what can be done to address this limitation?
Well, the article mentions a prompt engineering technique called chain of thought prompting.
Chain of thought prompting.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Okay.
But essentially, it involves guiding the model to break down a complex problem into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay, so it's like giving the model a roadmap for how to approach the problem.
Right.
That's helpful.
It is.
And figure 2 in the article shows an example of this with calculating adrenal washout.
Yeah, it illustrates how chain of thought prompting can help the model arrive at the correct answer.
And the article also mentions that providing detailed feedback on the model's reasoning process during fine-tuning
Yes.
can also help improve its ability to handle more complex tasks.
Right. So it's like training the model to think more like a radiologist.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, now another point the article raises is stochasticity,
Oh, yeah.
which refers to the inherent randomness in the responses that LLMs can generate.
Right.
And how can that be a problem in radiology where consistency and reliability are so important?
Well, because LLMs are based on probabilities.
Right.
They can sometimes give different answers to the same question,
Even if the input is exactly the
even if
same.
the input is exactly the same.
Okay, that's not ideal,
No, it's not.
especially when you're dealing with patient care decisions.
Exactly. You want to be sure that the model is giving you consistent and reliable information.
Right.
So the article explains that there's a parameter called temperature.
Temperature.
Yeah. And this temperature controls how random the model's outputs are.
Okay.
So higher temperatures make the model more creative and exploratory, but also more unpredictable.
So it might come up with some interesting ideas, but you can't be sure if it's going to be accurate.
Right.
And lower temperatures make the model more deterministic,
Yes.
meaning it will tend to give the same or very similar answers to the same input.
Exactly.
Okay.
So for radiology applications, particularly those involving extracting key information from reports,
Right.
using a lower temperature is generally preferred because it has been shown to increase agreement and reduce variability in the model's outputs.
So it makes the model more consistent and reliable.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about data privacy,
Okay.
which is obviously a huge concern in healthcare.
Absolutely.
What does the article emphasize regarding the risks of using LLMs with sensitive patient information?
Well, it strongly cautions against entering any sensitive patient data into publicly accessible chatbots.
Like ChatGPT.
Yeah. Doing so poses significant privacy risks and could lead to violations of regulations like ASHA.
Right, because these public chatbots, they're not designed to handle protected health information.
Exactly.
And the data you enter into them could potentially be accessed by others.
Right. Or it could be used to train the model without your consent.
So that's a big no-no.
Yeah, it's a big no-no.
Okay,
So the article underscores the need for privacy-preserving LLM solutions.
like what?
Well, one option is to deploy models locally within a secure healthcare environment.
So the data never leaves the institution.
Right.
Okay.
Another option is to use IOPI-compliant application programming interfaces, or APIs,
APIs, yeah.
which allow you to access the LLM's capabilities without actually sending your data to the third-party provider.
So the institution retains control over the data?
Yes.
Okay, those are good options.
Yeah, they're important considerations for ensuring patient privacy.
Absolutely.
And finally, the article touches on the resource intensiveness of training and deploying these large models.
Right. It even mentions environmental considerations like water consumption.
It does.
So what are the practical implications of this for our audience?
Well, the computational resources required to train and run these massive models are substantial.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And that raises concerns about environmental sustainability because these data centers use a lot of energy and water for cooling.
Right.
And from a practical standpoint, it means that deploying and running these cutting-edge models can be expensive
Okay.
and require specialized infrastructure.
So it's not something that every hospital or clinic can just do on their own.
No, not necessarily.
Right.
But the article does mention some mitigation strategies.
Like what?
One approach is to use smaller, more efficient models for less complex tasks.
So if you don't need the full power of a giant LLM,
Yeah.
you can use a smaller one that's more resource friendly.
Right.
Okay.
And it also highlights the mixture of experts, or MOE approach.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Which is used in models like Mistral's Mixtral 8x7b and reportedly in some versions of GPT-4. And what MOE does is it divides the model into smaller, specialized submodels.
Okay.
And so for a given task, only the relevant submodels are activated.
So it's like a more efficient way of using the model's resources.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a clever way to improve efficiency.
Okay, so we've covered the potential benefits of LLMs in radiology.
We have.
And we've also discussed some of the limitations that we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
Now let's delve into some of the specific applications that the article outlines.
Okay.
It sounds like LLMs could have a significant impact at every stage of the patient journey,
Absolutely.
from the initial decision to order an imaging study all the way through to the interpretation of the report
And beyond.
and beyond.
Yeah.
Figure 3 in the article actually provides a really helpful visual overview of these potential clinical applications.
It does.
But before we jump into the specifics, it's really important to emphasize
Yeah.
that thorough validation and appropriate human oversight are essential
Absolutely.
for all of these applications.
We're not saying just let the LLMs take over.
No, not at all.
They're tools that can assist us, but ultimately it's still the radiologist's responsibility to make the final decision
Right.
and to ensure the safety and well-being of the patient.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start with the pre-imaging phase, which
Yeah.
is basically everything that happens before the images are acquired.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that LLMs could actually play a significant role here.
So how would that work?
Well, the article discusses several key areas.
Okay.
One is in clinical decision support.
Okay.
So LLM-based tools could assist referring physicians in making more informed decisions about when to order imaging tests.
So helping them to choose the right test for the right patient at the right time.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they could also help ensure that the imaging requests are complete and contain all the necessary information.
Right, because sometimes the requests are missing key details.
Yeah, and that can delay the imaging process or lead to unnecessary tests.
So LLMs could help streamline that process.
Neat.
And another area the article mentions is automated imaging protocol selection or protocoling,
Right.
which is basically choosing the correct settings and parameters for the imaging exam.
Yeah,
And that's a very time-consuming task for radiologists.
it is.
But LLMs could potentially automate that process
They could.
based on the patient's information and the clinical indication.
Yeah.
And that would free up radiologists to focus on other, more complex tasks.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are some really interesting potential applications in the pre-imaging phase.
They are.
Now let's move on to multimodal applications.
Yeah?
Specifically in generating reports.
Okay.
This is where I think things get really exciting,
It does.
because this is where the ability to understand both images and text
Right.
could really revolutionize the way radiologists work.
Absolutely.
How could multimodal LLMs be used to generate radiology reports?
Well, essentially, they can act as very sophisticated image captioning systems.
Okay, so they can look at an image and describe what they see,
Yep.
but in a more detailed and structured way than traditional image captioning models.
Exactly.
And the article mentions that recent progress with multimodal LLMs in this area has been quite encouraging.
It has.
And it highlights studies where clinicians actually preferred the reports generated by these models over the human-generated reports in some cases.
Yeah, for certain types of images,
Right.
like chest x-rays, for example.
So that's pretty amazing
It is.
that these models are actually able to generate reports that are as good as or even better than what humans can do.
All right. And the key here is that medical diagnosis is inherently multimodal.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
We did.
You're not just looking at the images, you're considering all the other information as well.
Right.
So LLMs that can integrate all that data are likely to be the most accurate and effective.
Exactly.
And the article mentions that LLMs integrating clinical and imaging data are already showing improved performance.
They are.
So this is definitely an area to watch closely.
Absolutely. It's a very promising area of research.
Okay, now once the reports are generated, LLMs could also play a role in improving the reports themselves.
Right.
And how clinicians extract key information from them.
Yes.
So the article talks about using LLMs to automatically generate initial impressions,
Yeah.
converting free text observations into structured report elements,
Right.
and even suggesting possible differential diagnoses.
Absolutely.
So they can really help streamline the reporting process
They can.
and make it more efficient and accurate.
Exactly.
And the article mentions that several commercially available tools are already starting to incorporate some of these features,
They are.
which is really exciting to see.
It is.
And it also highlights the ability of LLMs to extract and classify crucial information from existing radiology reports,
Yeah.
which could be invaluable for tasks like automatically flagging critical findings and alerting referring physicians in a timely manner.
Right.
So that could really improve patient care
It could.
by ensuring that important information is not missed.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's shift gears again.
Yeah.
Okay. And talk about an area that often gets overlooked but is incredibly important:
And what's that?
improving patient health literacy.
Yes, that's a crucial one.
Yeah. So for our audience, as the providers of this crucial diagnostic information,
Right.
how might LLMs play a role in helping patients understand their results?
Well, poor health literacy is a widespread issue,
It is.
and it can negatively affect patients' understanding of their conditions, their adherence to treatment plans, and their overall health outcomes.
Absolutely.
So LLMs have the potential to bridge that gap
Okay.
by making